So much, Joyce. Really appreciate it. And thanks everyone for joining us for today's edition of Ecosystem Talks. Really excited for this conversation with Abby, who I'll introduce in a moment. We're talking today about bridging the rural-urban divide, building connected regional ecosystems. Abby and I have gotten to know each other over the last year or so as she participated in Super Connect, the inaugural Super Connect conference last year. So came up from Arkansas and has been just a wonderful thought partner for us at EcoMap ever since. Abby Smith is the program manager for entrepreneurship and workforce development at Heartland Forward, where she leads initiatives focused on fostering innovation, supporting entrepreneurs, and strengthening the talent pipeline across the Heartland. A University of Arkansas graduate, I believe they have a big game today. Correct me if I'm wrong, Abby. With a bachelor's and master's in social work, Abby has a deep-rooted passion for community-driven economic development. Before joining Heartland Forward, she spent 7 years at SOAR after school, progressing from site director to director of operations and development officer. From site director to director of operations and development. After SOAR, Abby served as community development officer at the Bank of Fayetteville, where she led regional efforts in strategic community development, philanthropy, and public relations. Her dedication to building strong, thriving communities is shaped by her upbringing in a small rural town, giving her a unique perspective on the challenges and opportunities in the heartland. She's driven by a commitment to innovation and community growth. Abby continues to champion initiatives that empower individuals, businesses, and communities to thrive in an evolving economy. Abby, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, really excited to be here. Thanks for the intro, Sherrod. It's definitely been fun getting to work with EcoMap and getting to know you all over the past year. And I do have to give a nod to my Razorbacks. They are playing tonight at 6 against Kansas. Had to wear my red to represent, so I am an Arkansas Razorback through and through. So I did also just want to take a second to intro you all on the call to Heartland Forward, who we are, what we do. So we are a policy think and do tank, the only one in the nation completely dedicated to advancing the economy of the 20 states that we define as the heartland. So geographically on a map, you're looking at everything from Texas up through the Dakotas, over to Michigan and Ohio, down to Alabama, and all the states in between. So the work we do on the ground is, we do cutting edge, qualitative, quantitative research in-house, and we deploy that across the heartland via policies, programs, convenings, partnerships. And as we work to grow the economy and opportunity in the heartland and help it continue to lead as the third largest economy in the world, we do that through 3 key impact areas, which are regional competitiveness, talent pipeline, where I sit, and then also health and wellness. And we'll throw a few links to you guys to our webpage and some resources we have, but just wanted to give that little intro to who we are and what we do in case some of you have never heard of Heartland Forward.
Thanks, Abby. And just for our participants, I think Joyce may have mentioned this, but if you have questions, feel free to use the Q&A and we'll try to cover those towards the end. But in the meantime, are you ready to jump in, Abby?
Yeah, let's dive into it.
Cool. So from your perspective, how do urban and rural regions experience economic growth differently? Like, I'm trying to highlight what are some of the similarities and what are some of the difference based on your experience at Heartland Forward?
Definitely. So I think that, urban areas, from my perspective, I think that they see growth through, innovation clusters that they have, and I'll define that. But I also think then that rural communities, they experience their growth through their industry anchor, their localized supply chain. And I think both are really vital to, economic resilience across the country, but definitely experience it differently. So what I mean by, an innovation cluster, I'm looking at a concentrated geographic area where you have a combination of businesses, research institutions, startups, all in one spot together, driving innovation, collaboration, economic growth, and they're all benefiting from shared talent, infrastructure, and investment. And so, an example from our work at Heartland Forward, I would give of that, that's a really great and growing example, is Tulsa, Oklahoma. So, if you're looking at just the city of Tulsa, you're, just under 500,000 people. But if you're looking at the larger Tulsa metropolitan area, which is making up about 7 counties in Northeast Oklahoma, you're just over 1 million people. So in that 7 county region, you have all those key elements. You have industry where they've historically been oil and gas, but now they're pushing into advanced manufacturing, aerospace, tech, healthcare. You have the infrastructure. You have one of the second largest inland waterway ports in the entire country there. You have Tulsa International Airport. You have, access to several major highways and trade routes. And then you have a really booming tech and startup ecosystem that's growing. Would give a nod to, a close partner we've worked with, Tulsa Innovation Labs, is leading a lot of this great work. They're backed by the George Kaiser Family Foundation, and they're really working to grow this ecosystem, make it a place where people want to come and start their business. You have strong public-private investment and collaboration. Tulsa just this past summer got, a $51 million EDA grant to support their investment growing into aerial mobility, like autonomous vehicles, those sort of things, growing into tech. And then you also, to round that out, you have the workforce and research pipeline right there too in the region. You have University of Tulsa, Oklahoma State University Tulsa campus, you have local community college that kind of rounds out that whole geographic area where you have all this shared investment, shared infrastructure in the region. And then looking at, from a rural perspective, one that actually came up for us somewhat recently, we connected with the mayor of Findlay, Ohio, which is a really awesome example of a rural community that has that industry anchor and localized supply chain that allows them to see that growth. So if you're looking at Findlay, Ohio, it's, community about 40,000 people. Northwest Ohio, it's, 50 miles south of Toledo's hub that has, well over 200,000 people. But this community is thriving because they know their industry anchor, and it's manufacturing. They have a dense manufacturing base, and it's anchored by a few key players. So you have Marathon, there's Goodyear, there's Whirlpool. And just to call out, Marathon specifically, they're the second largest employer in Findlay, just behind the healthcare system. They're worth almost $50 billion. Their history traces all the way back to the late 1800s oil company in Ohio, but they've been headquartered in Findlay since 1905. So you're looking at this real anchor that's been there over 100 years. And so that community collaboration is centered around that anchor. So you have the community college, the University of Findlay. They work together with industry to develop their talent pipeline, which is tailored to manufacturing and supply chain management. So they're offering apprenticeship programs, training programs to make sure the students in their community are prepared for the high-tech manufacturing jobs they have now and in the future. So, tying all those pieces together, they have the localized supply chain, they have their industry anchor, they have a structure set up to develop their talent pipeline, and it's made them an economic powerhouse with, just the population of 40,000 people. They're consistently a top performer in the nation, and definitely like a good model of what growth in like a rural area looks like.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Abby. And I know when we were preparing for this, we really wanted to use manufacturing as sort of a case study or an anchor to highlight some of the
Mhm.
that you all are seeing. Um, so how have shifts in manufacturing and economic trends shaped entrepreneurship in these various regions, be it urban or rural?
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think that's a great question. And, by shifts, I think conversations we've had, between us and then other partners we've had, across states in the heartland, we're talking about, growing conversation around reshoring, supply chain, automation, workforce. And I feel like I can't emphasize workforce enough, the amount it has come up, in general, but especially in manufacturing. It's come up in almost every conversation that we had. Um, but I think that, there's some opportunity in the shifts. So like supply chain disruptions, while it's, disrupting the supply chain, I think it's also created new business opportunities for people to innovate within supply chain. So, maybe that's a growth in logistics startups or AI driven supply chain solutions and a push for localized production. And, I'm sure this will come up in the conversation, but mapping, ecosystem mapping has come up in this conversation as an opportunity when we're talking localized production. Where are people? We don't even know. I think that's an opportunity. And I also think that these shifts have caused policy and public-private investments to really have to drive change and help there be solutions. And I think, a few examples of that, the CHIPS and Science Act, that provides billions of dollars in funding specifically to boost semiconductor manufacturing right here in the US. And it has incentives specifically for companies to build in rural and urban America. And so, an example of this is Intel's $20 billion investment in Ohio that was bolstered by public dollars. Or, what I mentioned with Tulsa Innovation Lab, them leading the drive for Tulsa to get an EDA grant to help support their investment in advanced mobility. And so I think that while shifts can be challenging, like in urban areas, like land, labor, there's a high cost for that. And it makes expansion really difficult. If you're looking at rural, maybe operational costs might be lower, but maybe they lack infrastructure, whether that be broadband, the skilled workforce. And so it makes it harder to capitalize right away. And so I think while there are challenges, we're also seeing these opportunities pop up, whether that be new dollar investments, public-private partnership, or, entrepreneurs that work in these areas and they have innovative ideas and they're like, they work firsthand and they see, I can make that better. And they spin out a company of that. I think that that's like a real opportunity as well.
Yeah. So we've talked a little bit about Findlay, Ohio as a rural example. We've talked a little bit about Tulsa as more of an urban example, both obviously in the heartland. Where are you seeing successful rural and urban collaboration happen? And maybe a couple examples for the audience would help.
Definitely. So just to tee it up, I feel like it's important to say that like this is regional collaboration when urban and rural, I can't say those together. When those are put together, it's regional collaboration. That's what's happening. And I think, before examples, I think it's important to note that a successful regional collaboration is one that leverages strengths from both areas to drive shared economic growth. I think that's like a key piece where it's a symbiotic relationship and both are benefiting economically. And I think that that comes from an alignment in infrastructure, workforce development, industry, and all those coming together is where that like regional prosperity happens. And I also think, the most important piece to that I feel like I have to mention is that it doesn't happen without stakeholders being bought in and also participating. Like it's just not going to happen unless all people on the ground, meaning business leaders, policymakers, your educational and research institution partners, other community leaders. It doesn't happen without those people on the ground driving the charge and also participating in it. So I think that's where successful collaboration happens. A really good example that I know our team has been super excited to learn more about and, kind of see happen. So in North Central Indiana, there is a group called WIN, and I think they're a really great example of this regional collaboration. So they were established with a grant from the Lilly Endowment, and what they've done is unite 10 counties in North Central Indiana, and this is encompassing both rural communities and then, urban centers like the Lafayette, West Lafayette metro area, to really transform this whole region into a hub for digital agriculture and advanced manufacturing. So what they're doing on the ground in these 10 counties with their manufacturing and agriculture coalitions is they're helping accelerate the adoption of IoT technology, so Internet of Things, in both ag and manufacturing, in order to help enhance efficiency and productivity, which is obviously going to support both urban and rural. So they're helping advance the adoption of tech and automation, using sensors. Can we, predict when something's about to break down before it breaks down in order to prevent supply chain disruptions, those sort of things. But they've also partnered with the educational partners in the area like Purdue, the local community college, to make sure that alongside this adoption of tech in ag and manufacturing and advancing those industries, they're also developing a talent pipeline of people that are going to be prepared to fill workforce gaps now and then also those that come in the future. And then they go even further in their investment and collaboration with these counties that they've invested in the infrastructure. So their initiative even expands to investment in broadband to ensure that the rural communities can fully participate in these digital advancements, and also are seeking to bridge that digital divide, which I think is a huge piece of this too. If you're not connected digitally, you can't adopt these tech advancements. And so we really love them as an example of this. I think they've got a really holistic way that they're approaching this regional growth. Yeah, hopefully that answers.
Yeah, totally. And I think it's a great example of leveraging the resources that are there, and also filling the gaps, right? So as you think about like, what is our strategy to really fill the talent pipeline? What is our strategy to bridge the digital divide, et cetera? So in your opinion, Abby, how can access to things like funding, mentorship, resources be improved across regions, both within urban environments and in rural environments?
Yeah, I think, it's obviously so much different between urban and rural. If you're looking at urban, there's, co-working spaces, incubators, those kind of things, and you don't really see as much of that in rural communities. Like, more than I'm from a town in Northwest Arkansas that was 4,000 people when I was growing up, and we had a grocery store and a gas station and one stoplight. But we are regionally connected to the larger Northwest Arkansas area, that 2, 3, 4 county region. And so even though that wasn't in the town I grew up in specifically, it was there. And so I think the most, that's why I think the regional collaboration is so important, because it may not be in one place, but it's in another, and it just takes connection. Because if we're talking, entrepreneurship and startup, when we pulled entrepreneurs we've worked with, they all want mentorship. Like, that is so helpful, being connected to someone that has done it, can give them advice, and so I think that, with the node to ecosystem building and what you all do at EcoMap, like so important to bring together those regional assets, to be able to have, mentors and whatever. But that does take, as you said, funding. Like you can't just map stuff. It doesn't just happen. You have to invest in those sort of resources for the region. But I think that investments in those things are everything to help them grow together. That way rural communities aren't getting left behind, but with those investments, they do get to be part of that regional growth. And hopefully that answers your question. But I think it all has to do with ensuring that regional connection to make sure that one community is not being left behind.
And when those communities come to you, Abby, at Heartland Forward, and they're asking about, where should we invest? Like, what are the infrastructure investments we should be making to ensure that our manufacturers stay competitive? Like, what type of advice are you giving those folks today?
Yeah, and honestly, I think probably, the hot topic in conversations that we've had, especially like my team, we've talked with, economic development corporations at, state level. We've talked at local level with economic developers all across the heartland. And I really think what continually comes up is like investing in this, and infrastructure, I want to say too, is both physical infrastructure, but also we have to include digital infrastructure. It's 2025, technology's emerging, and that's kind of everything right now. I feel like making sure that they're figuring out how to adopt and scale the, industry 4.0 technologies is really everything. Like if we're talking, it's a rural community, we talked with someone, and I can't remember if it was North Dakota or South Dakota, but like they have workforce shortage. Their population is not significantly booming. And so they have to figure out, how do we automate in a way that could help offset workforce shortages? And so I think, kind of right now, everything is surrounding how do we automate, how do we adopt, emerging technology in a way to connect supply chains. So like this mapping piece, we've had a lot of conversations about mapping. And then, automation, how could that help with workforce shortages? How do we train skilled labor to be able to work in these automated, smart factories? But I feel like that's probably the most consistent conversation we've had with people is, how do we scale the adoption of tech and automation across manufacturing? And then I also think another piece to that is like, how do we leverage public-private partnerships to make this happen? I think there's like so much strength in those two being aligned. And I wouldn't say it's advice, but just more so conversations we've had, people trying to figure out how to make that happen. Like, how do we have these co-investments to fund critical infrastructure and growth so that, manufacturers can stay competitive? And, specifically in the heartland, it's like long been our economic anchor is manufacturing. And, we shared recently, Cass on our team, he is our director of research for Talent Pipeline, was talking about, he came across that new manufacturing firms, like while we have the largest share of like manufacturing in the heartland, like the largest share of new ones popping up are not in the heartland. And I think the question we should be asking is why? Like, how do we keep our area competitive where people do have the infrastructure, the investment, the workforce to continue for the heartland to be a hub for manufacturing and a leader in manufacturing? And hopefully that answers your question. I wouldn't say that like we necessarily give people advice, but it's more so like brainstorming, like what are the solutions to these hangups that people are having on, automating or workforce or, scaling even.
Yeah. And I think most of our audience is going to be a set of ecosystem builders or economic developers who have the opportunity, I think, to build bridges and facilitate collaboration and connection. And so one of the questions that I have for you is how can businesses work together to build a more resilient supply chain?
Mm, yeah, that's a great question. And I think even goes back to, what I said about regional collaboration. It takes everyone knowing that they have a role and then participating in whatever said role. Um, but I think, a couple of things here, and this is from recent conversations through the lens of workforce. But I think one is like leveraging partnerships for workforce development. Like businesses could co-invest in workforce training centers, maker spaces, industry-led incubators to really ensure that training aligns with those regional supply chain needs. Because if we don't have the people, then, the supply chain's not going to happen. If businesses aren't running efficiently because we have workforce shortage, supply chain is going to be disrupted anyways. An example of this is the Iowa Manufacturing 4.0 initiative. We had a conversation with them, and they're working with local manufacturers to upskill employees in like AI driven manufacturing. And this is helping ensure that companies all across the regional supply chain have access to skilled, trained talent that are trained in Industry 4.0. So they're creating not just a workforce pipeline in X and X location, but they're training all across the state to ensure that there's a larger pool of talent. And so I think that, people coming together to invest in regional talent is super important. And I think another piece is, okay, we get this trained talent. How do we keep them in the industry? How do we keep them from, I want to grow my career pathway, earn more money, going to a completely different industry? That just like cancels out the training that was invested because now we lost them to some other industry. And so I think retention of the skilled workforce is such a critical piece to the resilience of the supply chain. And I think this is another place that businesses, companies could collaborate to, provide a clear career progression, more opportunities, competitive wages, job stability. And an example that we've seen in that is in rural Ohio, there's manufacturing companies that have implemented this joint workforce mobility program, and it allows employees to move between companies within the same regional supply chain, to get those career growth opportunities instead of them just leaving the industry altogether when they're seeking career growth. And so I think retention not only at a company is important, but in the industry is so important because then we're just gonna have to retrain more people to the industry. And so I think those are two that really come to my mind, from a workforce perspective. That's kind of where my mind goes in like resilient supply chain is how do we keep the people, the skilled talent here?
Yeah, yeah, and just while we're on that, Abby, we are going to drop some polls to engage the audience as we continue the conversation. So the first question is, which of these best represents your experience with regional collaboration and resource sharing? So give us your thoughts when you get a minute, and we'll try to talk about some of the results either during this conversation or certainly as a part of our follow-up. So on the topic of workforce, Abby, from your perspective, how can entrepreneurship help here? Like, how can they create job opportunities in under-resourced areas? And I'm particularly thinking about, the normal progression of an entrepreneur starting in an urban area. I'm sort of putting this in quotes and using some generalities, but how can they participate in solving some of the workforce challenges that you alluded to just now?
Yeah, and I think that, this is a great connection to Heartland Forward's work that we've done over the last 4 years. So we have worked with the Builders and Backers Idea Accelerator over the last 4 years to fund over 1,000, early stage entrepreneurs to go through this curriculum, start companies. And this is like an on-ramp to entrepreneurship. This is everyday people that have an idea, and how do we help them, the tagline, get their idea off the sidelines and into action. And kind of our thing with that is, now that they've had this on ramp, that they have, stepped into entrepreneurship, how do we keep them in the heartland is one. So how do we get them to start locally, scale locally? And if they're able to do those two things, they're more likely to hire locally. I think, a piece to that obviously is like, most startup funding goes to, we know where, the coasts, not the middle of the country. So much work going on around investing in the country. There's great innovative ideas here. And entrepreneurship is such a huge thing that creates economic resiliency and economic growth in urban and rural communities alike, in regions. And I know you all see that in your work as well at EcoMap, but I think that entrepreneurship does drive growth in regions, across both rural and urban,
Mhm.
because it keeps investment local. Sometimes it creates new industry pathways. Maybe it's a small scale manufacturer that opened up in a main street in a smaller town. That's, they're going to need people to work in their factory. It's creating new industry pathways where, people can make stuff again, is just an example. And I think that having that entrepreneurship piece and a strong entrepreneur ecosystem helps build stronger small business ecosystem. Obviously, like, they're correlated, and that's, a huge employer of local people is small business.
Mhm.
um, and so I think that entrepreneurship is a huge piece to that, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm going to start layering in some of the audience questions as well, Abby. And
Okay.
on the topic of entrepreneurship, I actually want to start with a question from Karen Zuccardi. She asked, what role do you see local and state governments playing in fostering and supporting entrepreneurship? Maybe like a couple examples. I know there's a lot going on in Arkansas, for example.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, investment is everything. Like, when we pull our entrepreneurs, top thing without question, every conversation I've had, every survey, number one challenge, access to capital. Um, to scale, to keep going, to get past that idea and experimentation stage to actually like formally launch their business. I think that's a huge, huge piece. And I think that, like, that support from local and state government, it comes from investment. There's SBA loans, opportunity zone, like lots of things I think that states and local governments can do to support those entrepreneurs. But I really think the top piece is funding, and making sure that, there's policies that are small business friendly. These are everyday people in our communities starting businesses that maybe they still are working another job. They haven't even been able to quit their other full-time job to be on this venture full time. And so, you know, deregulating some things, whether it be like long drawn out paper processes to incorporate their business or whatever, every little thing goes a long way to helping our entrepreneurs be able to stay on that pathway and then be able to drive economic growth locally in their community and stay rooted there.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's kind of like my take is I think funding's the top thing. And then just like, what are the regulatory policies? And this is different across states, so I don't even want to broadly say, but depends on what community, what state, to make it small business friendly.
Yeah, yeah. And one of the things that you articulated is the role that entrepreneurship can play in developing a workforce. We talked a little bit earlier on about training workforce. Um, Lutalo Sanafu, sorry if I mispronounced that, asked, once we train workforce, how do we incentivize staying in the region? I know like Tulsa has done some really creative things, et cetera. I'm curious what you're seeing in terms of incentives to stay where you are and or to recruit others, new folks.
Yeah, I think honestly, one thing I actually saw recently is, and this is like not even necessarily training, but like Tulsa Remote, they provide a $10,000 grant for people to relocate their HQ to Tulsa to like have their business there, bring other people in. I think that's like a really interesting incentive. But I think a huge piece to training your talent and being able to keep them there is yes, job, but it's you want a place that is both great to work and live. And so I think that one piece of that is, are there career opportunities, a pathway for me to grow, but also what are the amenities? Is there good workforce housing? We're talking like arts and culture, recreation, food and beverage. I think it has, to get people and keep them, I think you have to look at all of those pieces. Um, I don't know if you want to speak to the Tulsa incentives, but yeah, I think that you have to have a little piece of everything where it's not only a great place to work, but it's a great place for them to live their life.
Yeah, yeah, totally. I mean, years ago, there was a bunch of research that came out that talked about the correlation between sort of arts and creative sectors and innovation and entrepreneurship sectors. So just speaking about like quality of life, um, type things, and we are seeing the arts start to adopt more of an ecosystem approach, actually, which I think is really interesting, especially as we think about sort of driving community development and economic development, both on the innovation entrepreneurship side, but also creating this quality of life where people just want to stay there. Whether that's like incentivizing that culture, incentivizing those experiences, et cetera. Maryland is doing a lot right now in sort of incentivizing Maryland to Maryland business interactions as well. So that's something that we're seeing rise in popularity. And so on the topic of collaboration, Joyce, if you wouldn't mind releasing the results of the first poll question, so we can talk through that a little bit. So which of these best represents your experience with regional collaboration, resource sharing? Looks like 45% actively collaborate and share resources across the region, but 32% occasionally, but are facing some challenges. But 0%, this is really exciting, 0% are saying that they don't currently collaborate. So everyone is trying to collaborate, I think, Abby, which is really exciting. I think one of the key elements within an ecosystem that we haven't touched on, and Lutalo actually also asked this question, but what's the role of colleges and community colleges in particular when it comes to training, workforce? How do they participate in this ecosystem in ways that help to drive the needle forward?
Yeah, I think colleges and community colleges are community anchors. Huge, huge piece to the puzzle. Even going back to the North Central Indiana example of their educational partnerships, in order to make sure that they are training the talent pipeline for now and in the future. I think they play a really key role. And that's not even just manufacturing, that's every industry. You know, we've seen some of our work in Missouri in our health and wellness pillar, and Maria on our team who leads that, they've partnered with a community college because they had a shortage of the healthcare workforce. And it's like, we're not getting people to move here. So what do we do? And they started a grow your own strategy, which we love. You know, how do we take who and what we have here and develop this, especially if people aren't coming? And so I think that they play a really, really important piece to just the total economy in general. Definitely not only manufacturing, you know, we're seeing that in health and wellness, with healthcare, pretty much across every industry, I would say. And so I think that they play a really important piece. You know, it's also important to note, like, it's hard to start new programs at colleges, you know, to start new courses, classes, curriculum, whatever. And we've even heard in conversations that, you know, technology is changing so rapidly right now that it's so difficult for places to get something off the ground that's relevant not only for right now, but in the future, you know. And like the Iowa Manufacturing 4.0, they're, you know, going on the ground, training the skilled workforce, but they're having to go back almost quarterly because it's changing so quickly. But, you know, colleges and community colleges, they're institutions, and those don't change quickly or adapt things quickly. And so I think there's even challenges there, but something that has to be figured out, because they are the key piece in helping develop the talent in the workforce for right now, today, but also what's going to come in the future that we don't even know yet as far as, you know, technology.
Yeah. Yeah. And you've alluded to a couple times Industry 4.0, Abby. So I'm going to ask a direct question about that. And that's, how are manufacturers using AI and digital tools to scale and stay competitive?
Yeah, I think that, you know, one way is adapting it, you know, automation and technology to address workforce shortages. That's definitely a key thing that we've seen. Like I mentioned in the Dakotas, automation is a huge piece. Like, if you don't have the people, how do you keep going? You know, in order to stay competitive, to keep producing, to prevent disruptions. And then, you know, I think that AI, these data-driven insights, you know, and I mentioned like adoption of IoT. These are things that are going to, you know, help prevent potential disruptions in the supply chain, gonna, you know, optimize inventory. You know, I think that those are, you know, super important. Definitely a way that people are using it to help reduce costs and waste. If something breaks down, it's going to be really expensive to fix and take time. That machine or line is not working and it's not producing, which is where I think that the adoption of that Industry 4.0 is huge. How can we prevent that? Like when in North Central Indiana, using these sensors, you know, where you don't have to have a person doing it. You have the sensors that are, you know, monitoring the machines, and they know, okay, when it starts to make this sound or vibrate in this way, it means it's about to break down, and can flag it before that happens. Like, that's saving so much time and money. And I also think that, you know, those two key pieces, adopting those, I think is really important. But it also makes, you know, investment, like investors, partners, grant applications, whatever, if you're adopting this technology, these Industry 4.0 things, it probably makes it more attractive to those people, investors, grants, whatever. And so I think we're only scratching the surface of how people are using it to stay competitive. And I think it's really exciting to see what is going to come in the future of how it's going to be adapted and adopted for manufacturing.
Yeah. Yeah. And on that topic, around digital infrastructure, advanced tooling, et cetera, we have another poll question. This is the last one, but it's what digital infrastructure gaps exist in your region? And we have a few options there. So we'll come back to that in just a second. Before we close out, Abby, one final question. What steps do you think are needed to ensure rural businesses have the same tech advantages as urban ones?
Yeah, that's a great question. A question probably every member on our team at Heartland Forward loves, because we feel really passionately about this. But I think the first place that you really have to start with this is broadband. Huge piece. It's a large part of the work that we do at Heartland Forward through our Connecting the Heartland initiative. But through that, we're working to ensure that every American family in the Heartland has access to affordable, reliable, high-speed internet. And I think that that's what will help them, fully participate in the digital age. And I think that, excuse me, this also goes into, manufacturing and business and rural versus urban. Like if you have a rural community that is not connected to reliable and affordable high-speed internet, they're automatically not going to have the same tech advantages as an urban center. And, we say often on our team that access to broadband is the number one economic issue of our time. Like when people and businesses have access to that, doors open to them, whether that be collaboration, employment, training, education, healthcare, all of it, because they have access to that. And people that don't, they're getting left behind. And so I think that that is the first piece I would mention is like, we have to make sure that everyone is connected, that we close the digital divide, number one, like what WIN is doing for the rural counties in their region. They're making sure that they're not digitally left behind. I think that's the number one thing. Number two, going back to adopting that industry 4.0, if we're talking a rural person or manufacturer, business, whatever, it's going to help them stay efficient and productive in a smaller shop compared to in an urban center. And so I think adopting that automation, AI, industry 4.0 is important. And I think another piece of this is like mapping, and I know we've talked a lot about that. Our team's talked a lot about that, but like mapping the assets of your community, that I think that's so helpful, especially in, regional areas, seeing what all is here in terms of supply chain, assets, resources, X, Y, and Z. So I think those would kind of be my three things.
Yeah. Amazing. Thank you so much, Abby. This has been an incredibly informative conversation. I think you hit the nail on the head based on what we saw in the poll results. So one was lack of funding for tech initiatives. You talked about that earlier. And then 31% of folks talked about inadequate access to broadband, which I know you all at Heartland Forward are tackling with all your energy within the Heartland. Any closing thoughts, Abby? What's the best way for people to get connected to you, to Heartland Forward, to follow your work, or to work collaboratively with you all?
Yeah. You can email me. Also, I'm going to put if it's not already in there. Okay, great. Joyce dropped in. There's our newsletter. That's a really great way to keep a tab on, what our work in the Heartland is. Pulse of the Heartland is a brand new thing we just rolled out, and it's meant to be a resource to people in the Heartland for, data-driven insights, research in health and wellness, talent pipeline, regional competitiveness, great ways to stay connected with us. And then for anyone on here, I'll drop my email in the chat. You can feel free to reach out if you have specific questions on, what we're doing or want to connect with us. I'm always happy to make connections. And
Yeah.
I think like my closing thoughts for everyone on here, I think it seems like such a daunting thing, like, for the people on the poll that said, I want to do more, but I don't know how. Um, Seems like a really big task, but I think that every person on here, we can all do something, and all the small things create momentum. Every small action creates momentum. And like, I would just encourage everyone, like, start with your network, with your circle, whether that be the company you work for, the industry you're in, the community you live in. What strategic connections can you make? What's missing? Regional collaboration, it starts with connection. Um, so make those connections strategically, and then use your voice. I think advocacy is everything, and like, get to know your local economic developers, your local policymakers, business leaders, and talk with them about experiences, ask them questions, share insights. And I think that's a good way to get the ball rolling in your own community, in your own circle.
Thank you so much, Abby. A couple quick housekeeping things. If you asked a question and we did not get to it, we're going to try to answer it as a part of the follow-up. We typically do a blog post. We'll also send the recording to everyone. Abby graciously provided her contact information. There's also a link to the Heartland Forward newsletter. They have this really cool Pulse of the Heartland that they've got going on, so encourage everyone to check that out. And then Joyce just dropped the EcoMap LinkedIn newsletter as well, in case folks want to follow that. Otherwise, we are available on all major social platforms. EcoMap Tech, typically our website is www.ecomap.tech. Otherwise, I hope everyone has a wonderful day. I root on Arkansas Razorbacks this evening and wish you all the best. And thanks so much for joining us, everyone. I hope everyone has a great day.